Kia ora everyone, I'm Jacob Anderson and today I have Dr. Rosie Bosworth. Rosie is a future foods and agriculture consultant with specialist knowledge in plant-based and alternative protein systems and new food strategy. Rosie, thanks for joining me.
No, not a problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, amongst all of the lockdown at the moment, obviously food production is really absolutely critical, and the challenge now for New Zealand is how we start to look at rebuilding certain systems, and we are seeing this rise in plant-based and reduction in meat consumption. What are some? Why are we starting to see some of those trends?
I think that's a multifaceted answer. Especially with the younger generation, what we're seeing is a rising cognizance of the environmental impact that animal agriculture or raising animals for food has on the environment. A lot of animal production systems around the world, while New Zealand is pastorally raised, a lot of our cows are free ranging and we have beautiful backcountry sheep stations and all sorts. The reality is around the rest of the world, much of the food or animal protein that we consume is grown in feedlot farms or in factory farms, which comes with it huge environmental costs, not only in terms of the deforestation to grow crops to feed these animals, but also in terms of the CO2 or the emissions and the methane runoff and all the runoff and that comes off these plots of land due to animal consumption. Or animal production, I should say. But so the environmental aspect is one, though we do have a rising cohort of consumers, particularly young consumers, that are steering away from animals for their own natural health. Under the belief that plant-based proteins or alternative protein consumption is better for them, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all sorts that come with highly processed animal meat. And then we also have the ethical concern of is it now considered okay to eat an animal when we have, or eat and kill an animal when we have alternative means to produce meat or produce proteins that are still delicious to the taste. So lots of different angles that are coming into play now that are really pushing forward this new revolution of alternative proteins.
Yeah, as we kind of dip into some of those plant-based and cultured proteins, perhaps can you just quickly explain to those listening who may not be familiar with all of the different terms what plant-based proteins are and then what the cultured proteins are?
Yeah, sure. So what we often hear about is plant-based protein, and we hear about a lot about that, but there's a couple of different streams of alternative proteins coming online, as you mentioned, cultured proteins, and also there's mycoproteins or fermented proteins. And I'll just quickly talk through all of them because they're all very different, and they also have a different impact on your health and or the environment and means of production and all that whole experiential factor that you get at the end of it. So we've seen for many years plant-based proteins in various forms or plant-based or meat analogues. And back in the day, it goes without saying that these are produced from plants or plant proteins. So soy meat soy, for example, is a very sort of rudimentary type of plant-based protein. But what we're seeing now is this incredibly sophisticated type of plant-based proteins coming on the market, where companies and startups such as Impossible Foods or Beyond Meat are using not animal proteins, plant proteins, an array of them. That could be pea protein, it could be soy protein, fava bean, potato starch, or whatever the plant is that has a high protein content, and they're producing animal meat analogues that have the same taste and sensory experience of animal meat. So instead of, say, for example, a soy, you might have some soy in your Thai, your pad Thai or whatever, which tastes and feels and doesn't give you the experience at all of meat. These new plant-based proteins are mimicking meat, so that they smell like meat when they're cooked, they bleed like meat when they're cooked, and they're highly complex in terms of the technologies being used to enable these plants and the proteins used to produce them. And as more and more investment goes on in the space, these plant-based proteins are becoming more and more sophisticated and more analogous to meat, to the average consumer. Some people would do the blind tasting between a burger, a regular hamburger made with animal meat, and then a regular plant-based Impossible Burger, and some of them can't even tell the difference anymore. And it's the goal of that company to make sure that in blind tastings that no consumer around the world will be able to tell the difference between the two in terms of that experiential and taste factor. So that's plant proteins, and there's lots of companies sprouting up, so to speak, all over the world, including New Zealand, that are doing that. But then we also have this new wave of alternative proteins or meats on the market called cultured meats, which also have another word, cell-based meats or cellular agriculture. And this has got nothing to do with plants. This is actually harvesting animal cells. So we might take a swab of cells from an animal, the cow, for example, take the DNA, and we're going to culture that same DNA, the muscle tissues, the fat, the lipids, and all sorts, and grow that inside of fermentation facilities without the cow as the technology. So we're bypassing the cow as that piece of technology to grow this meat, and we're going straight to the end result, which is feeding these animal cells safely some what we call media or food or a soupy broth of nutrients, amino acids and sugars and starches, which is essentially, when it comes down to it, what a cow eats, if it eats grass or corn or whatever the feedstock is that it's being fed. And we're feeding that outside of the cow in a very controlled and hygienic environment where the same animal muscles and proteins and fats are growing. So end result, you have the same DNA structure, the same end result of a cow's meat, but you don't have the cow having to produce it. And that's what we're calling cultured meat.
And I think the best analogy to that probably at the moment is how we brew beer, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Because people are, a little bit weirded out by the whole, quote unquote lab grown meat. They think it's a little bit too sci-fi and not safe, or there's a lot of confusion around whether or not cultured meat is GM or whatnot. But it's essentially just using those cells and fermenting these cells in beer brewery type situations. And we've fermented food for many years, millennia. So there's nothing really different except for the end product in this is meat rather than, say, cheese or beer or bread or whatever else that we choose to ferment. So that's the best way to use it is, fermenting it much like a beer brewery.
And all of these techniques, I think some of them are using genetic technologies, and some of the plant-based proteins aren't. But why, if we can create the same molecular structure as we can with the real meats, why do you think there's still this fear or this reluctance from some consumers to kind of take on some of these products?
I think that's a human psyche or sort of a cultural issue around what humans are used to. Especially when it comes to food, you're a bit, we're used to food being quote unquote natural and knowing its origins and not being fearful of what we eat and having a little bit of trust in that whole system and having it produced by, I guess, the guys in the quote unquote white coats in the lab takes away that, I guess, natural provincial story that you have with it, the trust that you know the local grower, or that in fact it is safe, because this has never been done before. So it's a kind of like a human experiment, to, you know, in many people's minds. But we don't see that behavior as being unique to just meat or cultured foods or new food production. This whole, you know, technology you know, quote unquote interfering with our traditional means of doing things. We've always had pushback. Look at the horse and cart. There was a huge amount of pushback when it came to the combustion car engine coming on market, and oh gosh, you know, what's this going, you know, this is going to be dangerous. How are we going to police this? This is going to be terrible for humanity, taking away the horse and cart. And you see it with the typewriter, and you see it with all sorts of modern technologies that have come on board and displaced old technologies. It's just that humans are a little bit reluctant to change, and until you start seeing the efficiency gains and just how much more useful, or in this case tasty, and just as healthy and safe these new alternatives are, humans just take some time to warm to a new system.
Yeah, I think IVF is another good example. You know, 40 years ago when IVF first came out, people thought it would be completely insane to be making babies in test tubes. Those efficiency gains that you mention is one of the real game changers when it comes to these products. If we can use less land, less water, and have less emissions, it seems like it's a no-brainer, really, but we are still getting that pushback from some of the traditional food producers. But the markets are showing there's this real increase in demand and huge investment in a lot of these companies. What sort of projections, or what are the markets kind of suggesting around the growth of these products?
There's been some work done around, there's been a lot of market research that suggests that the majority of millennials and or Gen Zs especially, they are the cohort that are younger than the millennials, are much more in preference of eating a plant-based or alternative protein than the traditional alternative, particularly should it require slaughter. And so as more money and more innovation comes into these products, you'll see a larger and larger, or faster and faster adoption of these products with the younger generation. But there's been some research showing that these new products may displace in animal agriculture should the technology come online all right and be able to scale for the amount of for the masses to actually produce it for the masses. But it could displace dairy and traditional animal agricultural products within, you know, a time period as short as 5 to 10 years time. That seems like unbelievable right now to think, oh, the cow or maybe cow's milk may be displaced in 5 years, but or at least commodity dairy powder. But you just see the ramp up in terms of the adoption of, say, for example, the smartphone or the iPhone, just how quickly that curve started its vertical hike upwards, that the possibilities are also there with technology development going as it is at the moment for meat, especially as more and more people and companies start to see those efficiency gains and the you know, potential health and health benefits of that too. So it could definitely come online sooner rather than later.
I think one of the arguments that we would hear that farmers would say to kind of counter that is we see this growing middle class in China and India that are increasing their consumption of meat and dairy products. How does that growth in the middle class in China and India with production from companies like New Zealand compare with this kind of growth in these new plant-based products? Is it a question of both products continuing and letting the market decide, or do you think there will be some kind of generational consumption difference between those two?
I think the market will ultimately decide, and I think what that will come down to is how efficiently and cost effective the technology that is being developed comes online and undercuts existing farm technology and animal agricultural products, because a lot of the forecasts are suggesting that the cost of meat, fermented meat or cell-based meat, will come and undercut very significantly the cost of, say, traditionally raised animal products, such as those grown in New Zealand. And what that means is that there may be a taste and a preference for New Zealand meat, and New Zealand meat and beef and lamb and dairy is no doubt, amongst the best in the world. That's not the argument. The argument is that if this technology comes online and is able to absolutely competitively undercut existing cost structures of meat production, then the middle class in China and India, if they have, if they're given two products, the taste is great, the experience of cooking it's great, the health benefits are great, and one of them's far cheaper but also significantly better for the environment, then it kind of is just a fait accompli in terms of what choice the consumer's going to make, particularly with the younger ones. Of course, you're going to get older generations wanting that beautiful piece of T-bone steak or Scotch fillet or whatever, or beautiful leg of New Zealand lamb. Of course, those preferences aren't going to die out tomorrow. But what you'll see is that the cost of production for animal farms will be so much more than the cost of production for these other alternative protein companies, that the price differentials will be so compelling that consumers will more quickly not want to have to pay 10 times more for a regular bit of meat raised from an animal. And then it just becomes slightly an almost game over situation.
A bit like the video stores trying to compete with Netflix in the end.
In the end, yeah. Particularly if Netflix was, say, it's $10, it's 10 cents. For example, I'm not saying this is the model that Netflix uses, but 10 cents to watch a movie on Netflix versus $10 to get the new release DVD. Then what one are you going to do? And that's the kind of argument that some of the research coming out is showing, that the costs in production will be so compelling that regular animal agriculture will only be but a niche industry, very niche, that economies like New Zealand can't afford to just hedge their bets on living off a niche economy.
So effectively, we would have New Zealand making really premium grass-fed quality cuts of meat and higher-end dairy products, but we would need to start looking at diversifying the way we produce food as well, and not relying on this mass-produced kind of dairy model that we currently have.
Absolutely, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our traditional industries will be wrapped around highly sophisticated traceability and provenance technology. They will have an incredible story to tell with that to command those premiums. They will offset some of the difference in the cost productions, but it will essentially push our industries, not just the food industry, but New Zealand in general, to think, well, where else can we use our smarts and our innovation, and where can we channel our human resources and technological nous into other industries where we can have a seat at the table. So that becomes a broader, I guess, socio-economic question. Where do we put our talents going forward? Is it, yes, we can produce incredible food, but is it better that we actually, diversify the portfolio and start to have our younger generation focus on other industries or new incoming industries where we can use that technology and biotech and science expertise into whole new industries that we can play a role in?
One of the challenges we have in New Zealand in this space, of course, is our genetic technology laws are non-existent or very restrictive. So that kind of opens up a question for a whole range of other issues. But how far can New Zealand survive if we don't start to look at different genetic technology laws with some of these new cultured meats or cultured proteins?
Well, I mean, it's a hard one to accurately pinpoint just how long. But if you think about agriculture and just what a percentage of the economy that it is right now, and what percentage of that is really premium agriculture versus, say, commodity dairy and processing cuts or processing meat for within the red meat sector, it may be 10 years before we've got time to pivot those parts of the economy or those parts of those industry sectors. It could be a bit longer for premium milk, premium dairy, and beef and lamb, but I wouldn't expect it to be any longer than 10 years for commodity meats. So that gives us a little bit of breathing space to either really tech up those industries so that they can transition some of their skill base towards playing in both, which a lot of meat companies and dairy companies are already doing, such as Danone, Cargill, Tyson's Meat around the world, Nestle. They're all investing in these alternative proteins. They see the writing on the wall, and they might say that it's because they think they're doing best by the environment, but they're looking at the bottom line, and they're saying if these cost predictions are true, then why would you play in an expensive, outdated system? So yeah, not a huge amount of time to play, but we do, in my mind, if we act swiftly, we do have a bit of time. And this isn't to be doomsday, because looking at what's happened with COVID, we're not seeing a whole lot of tofu fly off the shelf. We're seeing a lot of meat and dairy and milk products fly off the shelf. So there's clearly a market for traditional meats and proteins right now, just by looking at how quickly people are stockpiling on them. But it would be negligent, I would say, in the least, to not be thinking about new industries or how to pivot the existing ones.
I think a lot of farmers or people invested in traditional food production would see this sort of thing as a threat, but instead we need to look at the opportunity side of it and how this can help diversify New Zealand and help support them to kind of transition out to reduce that risk. How do we sort of help guide that pathway or help them understand the challenges ahead?
I think what is really necessary is to have really open conversations with farmers, particularly the younger farmers. Great workshopping, education sessions where we enlighten them around what's happening around the world. A lot of farmers in New Zealand, they rely on their industry bodies to provide them with information, but often that information is not always, I guess, telling the full story as to what's happening in the market. So independent education around market insights, and also how STEM technology, so science, technology, engineering, and math, can be used and applied by these farmers, particularly for the new generations, so that they can play a role in it and let the farmers decide for themselves what they want to do. Do they want to retire some of this land back to forestry or turn it into native reserve and start to tinker, or, I mean, tinker's not the word I'd like to use really, but start to really play a great role in developing some food processing technologies for these new foods? Or do they see they have a safe future by ignoring these new technologies and market trends? And take it to the farmers, provide open, transparent dialogue with them, and provide them with the tools and the education they need to make that decision themselves. And also potentially, have government and industry bodies helping them with that transition. Or providing them with a soft landing, so to speak, should they decide to switch systems.
Yeah, after having this conversation with you, I'd always thought that maybe in about 40 years, the next generation would have absolutely no interest in any form of animal agriculture. But now I feel like it might actually be a little bit sooner than that, where the next generation just won't want anything to do with animal agriculture, just because the opportunities and the cost and the environmental impact will just be so much less.
Yeah, it will be considered Neolithic, the old system, when all these technologies come online at a mass scale and at a competitive level. It'll just become a bit weird for the younger generation to think, Daddy or Granddad, did you actually kill an animal? Did you raise it, feed it all that stock, take up all that land, and did it use all those environmental resources just so you could get a hunk of meat off it, and you killed it in the process? That will become a really Neolithic concept to generations that will be coming online. And I don't think that will be a 40-year, as you say, a 40-year window. I think it'll be much closer. Let's just look 10 years ago where we were with the iPhone, and look how it's revolutionized the world in terms of smart technology now. I was just looking at, a friend was on WhatsApp with me last night, sending me things from 25 years ago when I was writing high school letters to her. And we were writing and sending letters to each other, which seems like archaic these days. I know my partner's kids would never even think about doing that sort of stuff. So, and that's only in the period of 25 years, to think about just how quickly technology is accelerating now to make that time, or that window of time, even smaller.
Yeah, no, it's been a real eye-opener. So thank you so much for taking the time today, Rosie. It's really interesting to watch this space, and I think over the coming years, it's going to be really such a huge transformation on how we view food. So thank you again.
Not a problem, Jacob. Not a problem at all.